Hiya, nerds. This is going to be a little different because we're going to look at some Dungeons and Dragons stuff. So some old vintage AD&D stuff. So if you've followed a long time before comics, I would often unbox D&D miniatures. I love D&D. I love comics and I love action figures. I love all nerdy things. Um, so even though I typically do comics, this is going to be D&D. So if you don't like D&D, just wait till the next video. It'll be back to comics. But a little story on this. A guy reached out to me. He bought a storage unit for $1,000. He opened it up and it was a bunch of D&D stuff. And he's like, whoa, man, this is weird, nerdy stuff. I don't like it. I don't understand it. And so he was going to toss it out. But on a whim, he reached out to my ad. And I'm like, yeah, man, I love D&D stuff. I'll look at it. He showed me a picture or two. And I was like, it's worth checking out. So from the time that I said I'll check it out to on the drive, he had looked it up. And so something that he was going to throw out, he suddenly got very greedy because he saw that he had a Dragon magazine #1. In fact, he had about 150 Dragon magazines, the first 30, and then, many others, but including Dragon magazine 1. And he saw on eBay that Dragon magazine #1 was listed for $3,200. And so, nerds, do not look at eBay listings. You have to look at eBay sold. Folks will list stuff on eBay hoping they find a sucker that'll buy it. I call that the Nick Cage effect, because Nick Cage used to just go on and just, he's rich. He would just buy whatever, no matter the price. But a normal person would not pay $3,200 for Dragon #1. It is rare, it's valuable, it's awesome. As Andy would say, it belongs in a museum. But there was only one sold comp, and it was listed at $1,200 and took best offer. So, best offer was what? Anywhere from $9 to $11.50, right? And so it wasn't $3,200. So this guy got greedy. And I had to walk away. But there was some other stuff that he was going to throw out, which was a bunch of old Dungeons and Dragons modules, old school King of the Nerds, Gary Gygax stuff. And so that's what I'm going to show you today, because I did buy that stuff. Okay, nerds, if you don't know anything about vintage D&D stuff, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it a little bit. This was one thing that was picked up in a lot. Again, I would love to show you the cover of Dragon magazine #1, but I didn't walk away with it. I did walk away with some old modules. But before we look at the modules, there was one box set. So D&D, in the early years, they would create box sets. And so this was a little box that would contain a couple booklets, a couple maps, all the stuff that you would need to play D&D. And this was $18, and you would get everything in this box. And I checked it out, and it is complete. So you'll see it came with a couple manuals and all that you would need, some maps and that sort of thing. Spelljammer was famous because this was AD&D in space. So AD&D is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. This was still the very early years after Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax invented the game in the early 70s. And by the 80s, TSR was cranking out so many products, it was wild. Spelljammer being one of them. So to get a complete box set like that is pretty great. If you want to know what the Dungeon Master screen looked like back in the day, in probably late 70s, here's what a Dungeon Master screen looked like back in the day. They are much fancier nowadays. And then a supplement for D&D might look like this. And it would be something that you would put in the mail away for, and you get maybe a packet of supplements in a manila envelope or whatever, and you'd you'd drop it off to Mr. McFeely and with a couple quarters, and you'd get some supplements. All right, let's get into the modules now. This is AD&D Eye of the Serpent. That was one I was not familiar with, actually. But look, it's a UK supplement, a one-on-one or group adventures for first level characters. So maybe the UK was why I wasn't familiar with it, or maybe I'm just, you know, normal and I don't know everything. Keep on the Borderlands is an adventure that most folks who have a familiarity with D&D will remember. This was essentially Gary Gygax invented the sandbox adventure. So again, this is written by the Godfather Gary Gygax. He was a machine. He cranked stuff out, and it was an introductory module. They were trying to get folks into the game for characters levels 1 through 3, and you started out in a keep, and it wasn't explored, and that's what we mean by sandbox. So adventurers would kind of explore a hex. They would discover things, and they would map it out as they go, and it was remarkable and amazing. So this is the B series. So that was B2. This is B1. So these introductory modules. This was a dungeon module, In Search of the Unknown. This is something that was pretty interesting. This was a solo adventure for character levels 1 through 10, and you'll see the invisible ink. This was where the invisible ink little marker would go on this Velcro here, and you would go in, and it was like a choose your own adventure book. And so you'd go in, and you could see there that you'd make your choice, and then you'd highlight that, and the words would appear. And so kids during this time thought that was amazing. I thought it was amazing. So the B series, this is the C series. So C2, this is the Ghost Tower of Inverness. Here is C1, which is a famous module. This is one of the ones where a lot of people look back to and say this was a classic module. So the C1, C2, let's see what we got here next. Oh, we have something entirely different. So Dungeons and Dragons was, you know, there were a lot of folk gaming groups in the Wisconsin, Minnesota area. This was obviously pre-internet. This was really early 70s, and these groups of nerds would get together. Gary Gygax in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, Dave Arneson up here in Minneapolis where I am, and they had their little gaming groups, and then they would start to kind of get together. They would find themselves like pen pals, and they would discover one another that way. They got together. Gary Gygax was more technical rules, and then he would write kind of open adventures. Dave Arneson is often thought of bringing the idea of maybe role play in, but you know, it was kind of this collaborative effort, and it kind of formed back and forth. They each had their own world that they worked in, and Dave Arneson, when they started the company, when they invented the game, Gary Gygax was a workhorse. Dave Arneson was a little more like laid back, didn't quite crank out the stuff, never got his ideas onto paper, and so he produced maybe 1/20th, or gosh, maybe 1/50th of what Gary Gygax eventually produced. So his name isn't really highlighted as among the creators as much as Gary Gygax is known, because frankly, Gary Gygax just put in the work, put his butt in a seat back at that time over a typewriter. But this is one of the rare Dave Arneson things that was produced. And this would have been talking about his Blackmore campaign. Dave Arneson had created a world called Blackmore. And this little booklet is rare and wonderful, and a piece of D&D history, because there's just not a lot of Dave Arneson stuff out there. So when I got this in the lot, I was thrilled. this isn't a module. This was an accessory book, but this is one of the best ones, quite frankly. This was a lot of fun. This was the Book of Layers. And so in this book is essentially just a bunch of one-pager settings to spark an adventure. It might be, oh, this is a dragon lair, and it will give you a stat block on the dragon and just give you a little text to get you going. And then as a dungeon master, you could drop adventures in and just have a great time. All right, you'll see how the modules are lettered and numbered. This is the S for special module. And man, is this one special. White Plume Mountain is, again, one of the most famous D&D adventures because this thing is buck wild and crazy and awesome. Lawrence Schtick was writing his first adventure, and he had a gazillion ideas, and rather than curate those ideas and edit them, he just put every single one of them in one dungeon module. And it is wacky, and it is weird, and it is so much fun. And if you want a fun D&D campaign, something like this, White Plume Mountain, is kind of the genesis of that. It keeps it wacky. So this was something a little different. So this was WG4. I was less familiar with that. It's a venture for Greyhawk, which was Gary Gygax. We mentioned Arneson was Blackmore. Gygax was Greyhawk. And I didn't know much about that one, so I was thrilled to get that. S2, now S3, another one of the most famous adventures for D&D, Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. This brought science fiction into D&D. So, you know, D&D, a fantasy setting, suddenly you had a crashed spaceship. And man, this one is fun and weird, and this is Gary Gygax just going for it. All right, we have module A1. This is another one that is extremely famous, and you'll see it's an adventure for character levels 4 through 7, A1. But then here's A2, and it's also 4 through 7, which is interesting. But you'll see a sequence here, A3, also 4 through 7, and then A4 in the Dungeons of the Slave Lords. So again, these are considered some of the greats from D&D history. Here is G series, the first of 3 modules. G, which, spoiler, is going to stand for Giant. And you'll see why. This is Steading of the Hill Giant Chief. Here is G2, the Glacial Rift of Frost Giant Jarl. These have some damage because, man, these are old. These got to be late 70s. I would guess 78 if I was betting. So early in the history of D&D, you know, invented like 74. So this was some of the very first modules, and this started folks on an adventure, a persisting storyline that featured giants. And so you had G1, G2, and then G3, the Hall of the Fire Giant King, which would be the capstone of that adventure. And then if you know anything about D&D, the giants, the taller they get, the more challenging they are. So this is the D series, Descent into the Depths of the Earth. And again, this is by Lord Gygax. This is D2, which is one of the more famous modules. And this is D3, which vaulted the Drow. If you don't know much about D&D, you may have still heard of Drizzt, which is maybe the most famous D&D character in novels. Drizzt, there are probably 40 Drizzt books. I read them as a kid. My nephew reads them now. They're fantastic. Bob Salvatore has written those books and created the character Drizzt, who is a Drow. Drow live are dark elves, and they live in the Underdark. And they are known to worship the Spider Queen. And so you see all that imagery here. And so this was a persisting storyline, would go through these modules, that would be the capstone here at the Vault of the Drow. And this became a very famous module, for very good reason. Here's D3. I think D went to Q, which was the queen of the something like Demon Web Pits or something like that. So 2 of those, and excuse me, we're going to end on this one, which is a final Gary Gygax module that I frankly was not familiar with. So I love that I have it. All right, nerds, that was something really different. So we went from comics to D&D, but if you're here for comics, we'll be back to comics next video. But hopefully that was interesting for you, looking at some of the classic D&D adventures. You know, D&D has been part of our culture for 40 years now, and so these are pretty sweet that I was able to find these from a guy who got a storage shed that had no idea what they were and was just going to throw them out. But I love them.